Hello everybody, just recently I made a video in which I said anybody currently on the hunt for an interesting convertible and with a budget of about £10,000 should consider the oft-forgotten Fiat Barchetta. And today's video aims to answer almost exactly the same question, but for those with slightly deeper pockets of, let's just say, £100,000. And the suggestion that I have is one that many would consider to be crazier than the Fiat. It's this, the Aston Martin DB11 Volante. Now, I know exactly what you're thinking. James, you madman, haven't you noticed the fact that the DB12 has now been launched in both coupe and convertible guise, and it is the car that everybody wanted the DB11 to be? Many consider it to be far prettier, and most importantly, it also replaces the Mercedes-Benz parts bin special interior with a bespoke, and I'll admit, much nicer affair. And although I can certainly see the logic of why you'd consider the DB11 to be a terrible purchase, I respectfully disagree. But before I get on to my reasoning, let me tell you first a little bit about the car and why its owner Brian purchased it just a few months ago. The DB11 was introduced back in 2016, replacing the much-loved DB9, which had been around for quite some time, about 13 years in all, though truthfully, in the middle of that period, it did morph into essentially a completely different car. In any case, the DB11 was a genuinely all-new affair, built on a new platform, still using extensive amounts of aluminium, but unlike the extrusions of the 9, the DBS and the Vanquish, it instead had a greater selection of pressings, and it was a fair bit heavier. By this point in time, we all knew that Aston Martin had joined forces with Mercedes, so it was something of a surprise when the DB11 was announced not with a Mercedes engine, but instead a genuinely Aston Martin 5.2-litre version of their V12, now with twin turbos, in place of the old 5.9-litre naturally aspirated unit. This naturally brought with it a healthy bump in power, but more importantly torque. It was, however, the interior which drew the greatest criticism, because though it still retained the classic Aston Martin blend of beautiful materials, nice leather, aluminium, carbon fibre, so on and so forth, it also had a great amount of Mercedes-Benz in it too. But not just that, it was old Mercedes-Benz. Even in 2016, this was not the latest and greatest infotainment, and many were rather upset. Not only is it a horrible system that nobody really ever liked, it was fiddly to use, it also didn't at launch have Android Auto and Apple CarPlay, which the outgoing Aston Martins did. Although I thought the car actually sold well, on account of the fact that I saw a lot of them about soon after launch, apparently it did not meet Aston's expectations, and so very soon after they introduced a number of new models, including the DB11 AMR, which was actually a complete replacement for the base DB11, still featuring the V12, but also the anticipated DB11 V8, featuring the 4-litre Hot V twin-turbo Mercedes unit as seen in the E-Class, C-Class, S-Class, SL, AMG, GT, etc, etc. And then you also got, in 2018, this, the DB11 Volante, available exclusively with that Mercedes V8 engine, on account of the fact Aston Martin said that by using the V8 they were able to offset some of the weight gain made in the transition from coupe to convertible. The car put on some 110 kilos, and true to their word, this is only about 30 or 40 so heavier than a DB11 V12 coupe. In case you were wondering, all told, the car weighs about 1.9 tons. The engine makes 510 PS, that's 503 brake horsepower, and a very unusual 513 pound-foot of torque. And what makes that unusual is its 696 Newton-meters, not a nice round 700, which these things typically are. And I know there were plenty of people out there who looked at those numbers and the fact it has an 8-speed automatic gearbox, not a dual clutch, and said, that'll never be nice and sporty like the old Astons. Well, I happen to disagree. just like the coupe that I drove not too long ago, if you're willing to overlook the numbers, the DB11 Volante is a spectacular drive. And that to me is possibly the most important thing of all. The star of the show for me undoubtedly has to be the steering. No, it doesn't have the delicacy, the feedback, the tactility of some old Astons, but compared to just about anything else modern, it's fantastic. Easily as good, I would say, as that in my F12. It's got a nice weighting to it and gives you a real confidence in that front end. Incidentally, even in the Volante, Aston Martin worked hard to make sure the car still maintained a slightly rearward weight bias, with about 53% of it being over the back. And you do appreciate that. It is a wide old thing though, so even on this road, which I know fairly well, you do have to exercise some caution, particularly as, certainly with the seat in my preferred position, down low and far back, you don't really get much sense of exactly where the bonnet is. You can see some of it, but you're also conscious of the fact you can't see all of it. I've never been quite as big a fan of this engine as everybody else. For me, the 5.5 litre twin-turbo AMG is far more exciting. It's got even more grunt, but more importantly, no turbo lag. In its defense though, it has not just that soundtrack, but also a real keenness to rev. Some forced induction units, you get sort of vaguely close to the red line and they just kind of give up. This though, it pulls hard all the way to 7,000. I would love to be able to draw a comparison with the V12 DB11, but the fact is, I haven't actually driven one of them. In fact, I've only experienced that engine in the DBS, and in an environment where I really wasn't all that happy to use the power that it had. So if you do happen to have either a DB11 V12 or a DBS Superleggera, and you'd like to see it on the channel, please do get in touch, because they're both cars I'd like to try out. The one big dynamic issue that I do have with the car is that, particularly on the exit of a bend, maybe on account of that generous torque figure, it does seem very keen to engage the traction control. I've no interest in turning it off, but it is far more intrusive and noticeable than in, say, the equivalent Ferrari. There are plenty of times here where if I put my foot down in the F12, it'd just get on with it, and the car simply said, no. And every time I drive one of these Astons, I always feel like I have to make the point that the gearbox is really much better than people expect. I think it's just because it wasn't a dual clutch that people felt like they should criticize it as a point of principle. But the fact is, it's been tuned perfectly, particularly for me in something like this, the Volante, where the car has to be equal parts cruiser and sports car. Having the automatic just makes sense. It means that when you're bimbling along like I am now, it's a perfectly civilized thing. It changes gear imperceptibly, and when you come to a junction and the light, you can pull away easily. You don't feel it shuffling the ratios as you would in a Ferrari dual clutch. It's a good box. Then, when you're out on the open road and you want to have fun, you pull the paddles, here fixed to the column, not the wheel. It'll change down and up quickly, with every now and again the accompanying crack. And it's fantastic. I have absolutely zero issues with this gearbox, but I did have some issues with the DB11 when it came out. Firstly, the already mentioned infotainment. Secondly, the styling. I don't know why, but I just don't really like cars where they just sort of come to a point at the rear, like the F-Type and this. I also really didn't like the treatment around the C-pillar. It just didn't work for me. I preferred the look of the old DB9, the Vanquish, the DBS, and so on and so forth. And even the modern DBS, actually, I think, because it gave you a little bit of a kick at the back, was a far more successful treatment of the rear end. But these just never really worked. The Volante, though, solves this problem by, well, just not having a C-pillar, and I think it's actually a very fine-looking car, particularly in this gorgeous shade of Cinnabar Orange, which is a kind of halfway house between a sort of old-school brown and a more modern kind of in-your-face shade. If you told me it was an Aston Martin historic colour, I would believe you. The gearbox responds nicely when you're trying to reverse, you've got cameras up here, parking sensors, and it's a really easy thing to just potter about in. Oh, it does still have the old problem of every now and again you just accidentally tap the seat adjustment down here with your wallet and the seat just starts moving on its own. Some things apparently never change. So then, those are a few of my thoughts on the car, but what about those of its owner, Brian? He previously had a second generation Jaguar XK. Not the R, just the regular XK, because in his words, in a convertible, he doesn't really feel the need to have the biggest, most powerful engine. That was a car he'd had for a very long time, and it got to the point where the service book was full. So he figured that was maybe time to move on and try something a little bit different. He shortlisted a number of cars, and he required a convertible with 2+2 seating, not really for the ability to put people in the back, but more just to have a little bit of convenient luggage space to chuck your bags when you're touring, so on and so forth. He tried a Morgan, but found that it had a little bit too much buffeting. He considered a Ferrari California T and really liked it, but the particular example he was looking at he thought was maybe a little bit dodgy. He then looked at the relatively new Mercedes-Benz SL, but figured that was going to be a recipe for financial disaster, and so settled on this. He has a bit of a weakness for orange cars, and it currently sits alongside an I-Pace which has been liquid protected in a shade that is very similar. The fact that, despite Aston Martin's many claims to the contrary, the rear seats here are just as useless as they ever have been was irrelevant on account of the fact this for him is storage. The boot is a decent enough size for him. Like the Ferrari California, you get a little bit more space with the roof up, and he did say the Cali probably has overall a little bit more stowage space, but this also has plenty for his needs. As with just about everything else modern, these cars do have switchable modes, but I think Aston Martin did a very sensible thing and gave you two buttons, one for the suspension and one for the powertrain. He tends to drive the car with the suspension in its softer setting and the powertrain usually in Sport, not necessarily Sport Plus. Doing so gives you a marginally more responsive throttle and gearbox, as well as a slightly better soundtrack courtesy of a valve, which is then pinned open. I also do appreciate the fact that Aston Martin went to a lot of trouble to make sure these don't sound like they've got a Mercedes V8 in. Ride comfort is very good, and honestly it doesn't really feel like there's a big difference between the comfiest and the sportiest setting for the suspension. I think the difference in my Maserati Grand Sport is more pronounced. In any case, this isn't really a bad thing, because it means at all times the car is actually relatively plush, and even in its stiffest setting, you don't really get any scuttle shake whatsoever, which you'd think in the 21st century for a £200,000 car would be a given, but apparently, according to Ferrari, it's not. In fact, I would almost go as far as to say that over that little section back there, this is maybe one of the best damped cars I've ever tested. It's sensational, and yes, I've still got plenty of gripes with the DB11, the daft door handles here, which somebody told me were designed to encourage a Dutch reach, but I think it just bad design, irk me. The stereo by default is not great, but if you get the optional Bang & Olufsen one, it's fantastic, and yeah, the Merc infotainment really frustrates me. But as you can now get both official and aftermarket solutions for Android Auto and Apple CarPlay, that does remove one of the biggest issues I had with the car. Oh, and on the subject of that, this is silly. Look at the size of this key. I know people made fun of the old ECU, the emotional control unit, but at least it had a place to live in the dash, and this still doesn't have the blade in it. So you've got to carry around a nice sharp blade, which is going to make a mess of your phone or just about anything else, and they don't give you somewhere for this to sit where it goes nice and neat. It's, oh, Aston, that's a daft oversight. The Volante bit then fixes the styling, and while if you want the fastest convertible around, I'd point you in the direction of an AMG GT, a 911 Turbo, a California T, or a Portofino M, this, as an Aston Martin, I think just about nails the brief. Squeaky brakes aside, I am having an absolutely fabulous time. And yet, there will still be a whole bunch of people out there telling you, please, for the love of your chosen deity, don't buy a DB11. The DB12 is here, and now this car is going to be the proverbial bottom burp in an elevator. But I don't think that's the case at all, for one really simple reason. I'm not sure if you've noticed, but the original DB11, the coupe, has now slid down to the point where you can pick one up for £70,000. The Volante, meanwhile, which arrived a little bit later, starts at about 90 grand, with many great examples being available for £100,000. And in isolation, or indeed even considering its rivals, I think this is a fabulous car for the money. I'd have one of these every single time over a 911 convertible, Targa or whatever. It's just a far more interesting car and a better drive. Compare this to the 992 Targa that I drove not too long ago, and honestly, for me, every time it'd be the Aston, hands down. But I know what you're thinking. The DB12 is here. It looks better, has a better interior, it's quicker, it's going to be the car to buy. But it's also going to be ruddy expensive. At the point of filming, Aston Martin still hadn't made public exactly how much they were going to be charging, and the rumour was that for the coupe it'd be about £185,000. The convertible then has to be a fair bit more, maybe another 15 or 20,000, making that a £200,000 car before options, and I would expect you could easily add between 40 and 60 grand of those, meaning that to get yourself into a DB12 Volante, you're going to be spending £250,000. Even so, there are no doubt a whole bunch of people out there either very happy to part X their 11 for a 12, or panicking that the arrival of the 12 is going to depreciate theirs. And while if you just spent 150, 160, 170 grand on a DB11 or a DBS, you should rightly be concerned, if you've just picked one up for 100 grand, as Brian has, I think you should be very, very happy indeed, because it's going to take years before the DB12 can actually really influence the prices of this kind of DB11. Even better, this car was acquired from an Aston Martin main dealer with a 2-year timeless warranty, or whatever they call it, meaning that for the next 2 years, it shouldn't really cost its owner anything beyond fuel and, if applicable, finance payments. This is a lot of car. A heck of a lot. Oh, and it's half decent as well if you put the roof up, but honestly, a car like this, you've got to get it down at every single given opportunity. So then, that is a few thoughts from me on why I think the Aston Martin DB11 Volante may now be more relevant than ever. And if anything, the arrival of the DB12 and its likely eye-watering price is perhaps going to get people even more interested in these. I honestly wouldn't be surprised if that actually pushes the prices up. Will it? I don't know. In any case, that doesn't change the fact this is a great car. And I want to say a big thanks to Brian for bringing it out, and as ever to you for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button, comment down below, and subscribe if you haven't already. I'll see you for the next one. Bye bye.